Welcome to the deep dive. Today we are going on this incredible journey. We're going to explore synaptic plasticity.
Oh,
Um,
wow.
this is basically how our brains change and adapt based on, our life experiences.
It really is remarkable. Like, for the longest time, scientists thought the brain was kind of fixed and unchanging, like a machine.
Right, yeah, like set in stone.
Exactly. But then came the discovery of synaptic plasticity, which completely changed the way we think about how our brains work.
So you're telling me the brain isn't static. It's actually like always changing.
Always changing, yeah. So those connections between brain cells, the neurons, are constantly sort of strengthening or weakening.
Yeah.
And it's all based on what we experience.
Wow, so these tiny connections, synapses, they're where all the action is.
Yeah, exactly. Imagine your brain like a massive network of roads connecting different cities.
Okay, I'm picturing it.
So the cities are like different areas of the brain, right? And the roads are those connections between them, the synapses. Every time you learn something new, it's like you're building a new road or you're widening an existing one. You're making it easier for information to travel through your brain.
Oh, wow. That makes a lot of sense. So are these roads always like being built and reshaped throughout like our whole lives?
Yeah, pretty much. Our brains are constantly rewiring themselves.
Wow. It makes sense though, because, we're always learning and experiencing new things. But how did scientists even figure this out? Was there some kind of like aha moment?
There was. Back in the early 1970s, two researchers, Bliss and Lømo, they were studying the hippocampus. It's a part of the brain vital for forming new memories.
Oh, the hippocampus. Isn't that the one that looks like a seahorse?
That's it. So what Bliss and Lømo did was they stimulated a pathway of neurons in the hippocampus, and they used a high-frequency electrical pulse.
High-frequency electrical pulses. Did they fry the poor seahorse? What happened?
No, they didn't fry it. They found that those connections between the neurons, they actually became stronger. And this strengthening lasted for hours and even days. They called it long-term potentiation, or LTP for short.
Hold on. So they basically zapped these neurons and it made them better at communicating. How does that even work?
I know it sounds strange, but it was the first real demonstration of synaptic plasticity in action. And it wasn't just some random electrical effect. The strengthening was specific to the pathway that they stimulated. Other pathways in the hippocampus, they weren't affected.
That is fascinating. So they figured out a way to artificially boost the strength of those connections, which proves the brain isn't fixed, but it can be modified by experience. But how does this connect to learning and memory in the real world? We aren't going around getting our brains zapped with electricity every day, are we?
No, we don't need electrical zaps to learn. But what Bliss and Lømo's work showed us is that synaptic connections can be strengthened, and this strengthening can last a really long time. It's believed to be the basis of how we learn and form memories. Every time you have a new experience or you learn something new, specific neural pathways in your brain, they're activated and strengthened, just like those zapped neurons in the lab.
So our brains are constantly rewiring themselves based on, what we do and what we experience.
That's exactly it. And this brings us to a really important theory in neuroscience. Have you ever heard the phrase, neurons that fire together wire together?
Oh, yeah, it rings a bell.
Yeah, that's Hebb's postulate. It's named after Donald Hebb. He was a psychologist who proposed it back in 1949. He basically said that when two neurons fire together repeatedly, that connection between them strengthens. So Bliss and Lømo's work on LTP provided the first experimental evidence for Hebb's theory.
Oh, wow. So if two neurons are chatting a lot, they strengthen their connection, like to make communication easier. Is that how we learn new things? It all comes down to those connections getting stronger.
You got it. Think of it like this. When you're practicing a new skill, like playing the piano, specific neurons in your brain, they fire together repeatedly as you learn those movements and the music. That repeated firing makes the connections between those neurons stronger, making it easier for those signals to travel. So the result, you get better at playing the piano.
Oh, wow. That's amazing. So every time I learn something new, those tiny connections are being molded and shaped. But what about forgetting things? Does that mean the connections are getting weaker?
That's a great question. And it brings us to the flip side of LTP, called long-term depression, or LTD. It's basically the opposite of LTP.
So our brains are always balancing between strengthening and weakening connections.
Yes. Our neurons are constantly working.
Wow, it sounds exhausting.
It is, but it's what makes our brain so adaptable, so we can learn from all kinds of experiences. LTD helps prune away those unnecessary connections. It prevents information overload and makes the brain more efficient.
So it's like decluttering the brain to make room for new stuff.
Exactly.
Fascinating. So how does all this research on LTP and LTD actually affect our understanding of like habit formation or even things like therapies for conditions like Alzheimer's? What's the practical application of all this microscopic rewiring?
Well, for starters, it's helped us understand how habits form. Imagine you're learning to ride a bike. At first, it's challenging, and you're thinking about every single movement.
Right, trying not to fall.
Exactly. But then with practice, that sequence of movements gets smoother.
That's like second nature.
Yes, exactly. And that's because the neuronal pathways involved in those movements have been strengthened through LTP. The more you practice, those connections get stronger, and the more automatic the behavior gets.
Oh, so to break a bad habit, that would involve LTD.
That's right. You weaken those well-worn neural pathways, and you start forging new ones that are healthier. It takes effort and repetition, but it's totally possible because of synaptic plasticity.
So it's not just willpower. It's actually like rewiring our brains. That's incredible. What about like Alzheimer's disease?
Well, one of the hallmarks of Alzheimer's is the loss of synapses.
Those connections between neurons.
Yes, and this loss contributes to memory loss and that cognitive decline.
So it's like those roads in the brain are being destroyed, making it hard for information to get through.
That's a good way to put it. And that's why researchers are looking into ways to enhance LTP.
To slow down cognitive decline.
Exactly.
That sounds really promising. But we've only just scratched the surface of synaptic plasticity, haven't we? I mean, what else can it help us understand?
Oh, so much more. It's amazing how much we're still learning. Synaptic plasticity isn't just about making connections stronger. It's about fine-tuning those connections in incredibly complex ways.
Wait, fine-tuning? I thought it was just about connections getting stronger or weaker, like we were talking about with LTP and LTD.
That's the basic idea. But it turns out there are different types of LTP and LTD.
Different types?
Yeah, and each of those has its own mechanisms and timescales.
Oh, so it's not like a one-size-fits-all process. It's more like different flavors of synaptic plasticity.
Exactly. Some forms of LTP are really short-lived, lasting just a few minutes, while others can persist for days or even weeks.
Why would there even be different flavors like that? Why so complicated?
Well, it might seem complicated at first, but that complexity is actually what makes the brain so adaptable. And it's why we can learn so many different things. The different forms of LTP and LTD, they're thought to be involved in different types of learning and memory.
Okay, I'm starting to see how this goes way beyond just remembering facts like dates for a history test.
Yeah.
You're saying there are different ways our brains change depending on what we're learning.
Precisely. Think about learning a new language versus learning how to ride a bike. These require different types of memory and involve different brain regions, and the synaptic plasticity that happens in those regions, it's going to be different too. That's
incredible. So our brains are constantly juggling all these different forms of plasticity, strengthening and weakening connections in different ways depending on, what we're learning and experiencing. But how do these connections actually get stronger or weaker? What's happening at like the microscopic level?
At the molecular level, it gets pretty complex, but the basic idea is that it involves changes in the number and sensitivity of receptors on the receiving neuron, as well as changes in the amount of neurotransmitter released by the sending neuron.
Receptors and neurotransmitters. Those are words I haven't heard since high school.
I know, right? A little refresher?
Yeah, please.
Okay, so imagine you have a lock and key.
Okay, got it.
The neurotransmitter is like the key, carrying a message from one neuron to another. And the receptor is like the lock, a special protein on the surface of the receiving neuron. When the key fits into the lock, it triggers a signal in the receiving neuron. So in LTP, you might have more locks being created.
More locks.
Or the existing locks becoming more sensitive to the key. It makes it easier for the signal to get through.
So more locks equal a stronger connection.
Yes.
And LTD would be like removing locks or making them less sensitive.
Exactly.
Wow, that's really helpful.
It's through this intricate molecular dance that our brains are constantly adapting and learning from every experience.
It's amazing how much is happening at the microscopic level that we're not even aware of. But how does all this change as we get older? Does our ability to learn and remember decline because of something happening with synaptic plasticity?
That's a great question, and one that researchers are still trying to fully understand. It's true that certain aspects of synaptic plasticity, particularly in some brain regions, may decline with age. This could contribute to some age-related cognitive changes, like slower learning and difficulty forming new memories.
Oh, so that's why it's harder to learn new things as we get older. Our brains just aren't as adaptable.
Not necessarily. While some forms of plasticity may diminish, others may remain robust, and new forms may even emerge.
Oh, okay.
Research suggests that lifestyle factors like exercise, mental stimulation, and a healthy diet can help maintain synaptic plasticity throughout life.
Okay, so there's still hope for us old folks.
Absolutely.
So what are some of the latest discoveries in this field? What are researchers most excited about right now?
One exciting area of research is the development of techniques to visualize and manipulate synaptic plasticity in living brains. This allows scientists to see how those tiny connections change in real time.
Wow, that's like watching the brain rewire itself live. How do they do that?
They use techniques like two-photon microscopy, which uses lasers to illuminate individual synapses and even the tiny structures within them.
That's amazing. But what are the implications of being able to see these changes happening live?
It has the potential to revolutionize our understanding of learning, memory, and brain disorders. Imagine being able to identify early signs of synaptic dysfunction in conditions like Alzheimer's or Parkinson's disease.
That would be incredible. Early intervention could make a huge difference.
Exactly. And it's not just about disease, right? Understanding how synapses change could also lead to better ways to learn and enhance cognitive function.
So are you saying there could be ways to make people learn faster or remember things better?
It's a very active area of research, and there are definitely some promising avenues. For example, researchers are studying compounds that can enhance LTP, leading to improved memory formation in animal models.
That's incredible. But I imagine there are some ethical considerations when it comes to manipulating something as fundamental as learning and memory.
You're absolutely right. Anytime we develop technologies that can alter brain function, we need to be very careful. There are concerns about potential side effects, long-term consequences, and even the potential for misuse.
It's a bit like opening Pandora's box.
Exactly. The potential benefits are enormous, but we need to proceed with caution and make sure we're considering all the angles.
For sure. But we've been talking about adult brains this whole time. What about synaptic plasticity in developing brains, like in children?
That's a crucial part of the story. Synaptic plasticity is absolutely essential for brain development. In fact, it's the driving force behind the wiring of the brain during those critical periods of development.
So those early years are even more important than we thought. What's going on in the brain during that time?
During early development, the brain produces a ton of synapses, way more than it needs.
Wow, why so many?
It's almost like it's casting a wide net to catch as much information as possible. Then, through a process called synaptic pruning, those connections that aren't being used are eliminated, while those that are actively engaged are strengthened.
So it's like survival of the fittest for synapses.
That's a great analogy. And this process is heavily influenced by experience. The brain is essentially adapting to the environment, shaping its circuitry based on the sensory input it receives.
So a child raised in a stimulating environment with lots of opportunities for learning will have a different brain structure than a child who isn't exposed to those things.
Precisely. Those early experiences literally shape the architecture of the brain, influencing everything from cognitive abilities to social and emotional skills. This is why early childhood experiences are so crucial. They lay the foundation for all future learning and development.
That's a powerful reminder that nurturing those young minds is about more than just teaching them ABCs and 123s. It's about providing them with rich experiences that will help their brains thrive. But what about teenagers? I mean, adolescence is a time of major brain changes too, right?
Absolutely. Adolescence is a time of continued brain development, and synaptic plasticity is at the heart of it.
But teenagers are known for being impulsive and making, shall we say, interesting decisions. Is that also because of synaptic pruning?
It's definitely part of the equation. During adolescence, there's a lot of synaptic pruning happening in the prefrontal cortex.
The prefrontal cortex, that's the part of the brain responsible for, like, planning and decision-making.
And impulse control, yes.
So their brains are still under construction, which kind of explains why they sometimes act like they don't have a fully functioning prefrontal cortex.
You could say that. But this period of brain development is also a time of incredible opportunity. The adolescent brain is highly adaptable and capable of learning new skills and forming strong social bonds.
So it's like the brain is getting fine-tuned for adulthood.
Exactly. And understanding these processes can help us support adolescents as they navigate this challenging but exciting period of development.
Wow, this whole conversation has been eye-opening. I never realized how powerful synaptic plasticity is. It's incredible how these microscopic changes have such a huge impact on our lives, from our earliest experiences to how we learn, form memories, and even age.
It truly is a remarkable process, and we've really only scratched the surface of what there is to learn about it. But the research is moving so fast, and I have no doubt that we'll continue to make groundbreaking discoveries that will completely transform our understanding of the brain.
Well, before we get ahead of ourselves, I'm really curious to hear more about how researchers actually study synaptic plasticity. We talked about some high-tech imaging techniques, but what other methods are they using to unlock these secrets? Welcome back to the deep dive. We've been exploring this amazing world of synaptic plasticity, those tiny connections in our brains that are constantly changing and really shaping who we are.
Yeah, it's pretty incredible. And like we were saying, we've really only just started to understand how researchers are studying these processes.
Exactly. So we talked about those high-tech imaging techniques, but I want to hear more about all the different approaches scientists are using to study this. I mean, how do they understand these microscopic changes in the brain? What other methods are they using?
Well, electrophysiology has been really important for neuroscience research for a long time, decades really.
Okay.
It basically involves using tiny electrodes to measure the electrical activity of neurons.
So are they like listening in on the conversations between neurons? Like tiny little microphones?
That's a great way to think about it. By measuring these electrical signals, researchers can study how the strength of synapses changes, during LTP and LTD, and they can see how the amount of neurotransmitter that's released or the sensitivity of those receptors, how it all changes in response to different stimuli.
Oh, wow. So they can actually watch those connections getting stronger or weaker.
Yep, and that's given us so much information about how synaptic plasticity works. But electrophysiology is just one tool. Imaging is another really powerful technique. It lets us visualize the structure and function of the brain in such detail.
I've heard of fMRI and PET scans. Can those be used to study synaptic plasticity?
Those are great for studying brain activity on a larger scale.
It's crazy to think about how much is happening in our brains all the time, and we don't even realize it. But you mentioned earlier that researchers are studying synaptic plasticity at the whole brain level. How is that even possible?
It's definitely a challenge, but there are a few techniques that let us get a broader view. One of them is EEG, electroencephalography. It measures the electrical activity in the brain using electrodes that are placed on the scalp.
Oh, those little caps with all the wires.
That's it. So EEG can't see individual synapses, but it can detect those large-scale changes in brain activity, the ones associated with learning and memory.
So it's like seeing the forest instead of the individual trees.
Exactly. And when you combine EEG with other techniques like TMS, transcranial magnetic stimulation,
Right.
which uses magnetic pulses to stimulate or inhibit specific brain regions, we can actually start to map out those neural circuits involved in different types of learning and memory.
So we're getting closer to understanding how the whole brain works, not just those individual connections.
That's what we're working towards. But even with all these amazing tools we have, there's still so much we don't know about synaptic plasticity.
Really? Like what are some of the big questions that researchers are still trying to figure out?
Well, one of the biggest mysteries is how the brain decides which synapses to strengthen and which to weaken.
Okay.
What are those molecular signals that trigger these changes, and how are they coordinated across these huge networks of neurons?
Like the brain has its own code for deciding what information is important and which stuff it can just toss out.
Exactly. Figuring out that code would be huge for developing new treatments for things like Alzheimer's disease, where synaptic dysfunction is such a big factor.
So this isn't just about understanding how learning and memory work. It's about understanding how things can go wrong.
Yeah.
And how we might be able to fix those problems.
That's right. And another question is, how do different types of synaptic plasticity interact? We've talked about LTP and LTD, but there are other forms of plasticity too. And we're just starting to understand how they all work together, like how they actually shape brain function. It's like this complex orchestra with all these instruments playing together to create, this symphony of learning and memory.
It's pretty mind-blowing when you think about it. This has been such a fascinating look into how our brains work. It's amazing how much progress has been made. And it makes me think about how much more there is to discover.
It's a really exciting time to be studying the brain. And as we learn more about synaptic plasticity, I think we're going to uncover even more incredible insights. Insights that'll change how we understand what it means to be human.
Well said. And to our listeners, I hope you'll keep those synapses firing and never stop learning. Your brain is an incredible organ, and the more we understand about it, the more we can unlock its potential. Until next time, keep exploring and keep those questions coming.